Robert Mitchell lost everything in one fall: his hearing, his illusions, his truth. When a secret surgery gave him back sound, the first words he heard were his wife's betrayal. The ranch stretched across 300 acres of Virginia countryside, and Robert Mitchell owned every magnificent inch of it. At 38, he'd built an empire in commercial real estate that most men only dreamed of. The kind of success that gets written about in business magazines. The kind that makes other men either admire you or hate you, sometimes both. He stood in the stable that autumn morning, running his hand along the neck of Midnight, his prize stallion. The horse was restless, shifting weight from hoof to hoof, but Robert barely noticed. His mind was already at the office, running through the Henderson deal that would close by end of week. $15 million. Pocket change compared to his net worth, but still satisfying. "Mr. Mitchell, sir." Robert turned. James, the stable manager, stood at the entrance, weathered hands twisted in uncertainty. The man had worked the property for 12 years, knew horses better than anyone Robert had ever met, but right now he looked troubled. Midnight's been acting strange all week, real skittish. Storm's coming in later, and I'm thinking maybe today isn't the day for, "I've been riding since I was 6 years old, James." Robert's tone was polite, but dismissive. He was already reaching for the saddle. "I think I can handle my own horse." James opened his mouth, closed it again. His jaw worked like he was chewing words he couldn't spit out. Finally, he just nodded and stepped back. Robert should have listened. Looking back later, he'd replay that moment 1,000 times. The warning in James's eyes, the tension in Midnight's muscles, all the signs he'd been too arrogant to see. He mounted smoothly, settled into the saddle with the ease of decades of practice. Midnight danced sideways, nostrils flaring. "Easy, boy." Robert's voice was calm, confident, the voice of a man who'd never met a challenge he couldn't master. They started at a trot along the familiar trail that wound through the woods bordering the property. Morning sun filtered through leaves just starting to turn gold and crimson. It should have been perfect, the kind of ride that cleared the mind before a day of high-stakes negotiations. But Midnight's ears kept flicking back, his gait uneven, nervous. Robert urged him faster, thinking movement would settle the animal. They shifted into a canter, then a gallop. The wind rushed past, carrying the scent of approaching rain and dying leaves. That's when the deer burst from the underbrush. One moment the trail was clear. The next, a doe was directly in their path, eyes wide with her own panic. Midnight reared. Robert had experienced plenty of close calls over the years, horses spooked by shadows, by sudden noises, by their own mysterious equine logic. He'd always kept his seat, always maintained control. Not this time. Maybe Midnight twisted at just the wrong angle. Maybe Robert's mind was still half in that boardroom, not fully present. Maybe James had been right about the storm, making everything electric and wrong. Whatever the reason, Robert felt himself sliding. His hands grasped for the reins, for the saddle, for anything. For one terrible moment he was airborne, the world spinning in a nauseating blur of sky and earth trading places. He saw the fence post coming. Tried to twist away. Failed. The side of his head connected with wood and metal with a sound he would never forget. A crack that seemed to come from inside his own skull. Pain exploded white-hot behind his eyes. Then the ground rushed up and slammed into his back, driving every molecule of air from his lungs. He lay there, stunned, staring up at tree branches that swayed and blurred, tried to move, couldn't. His body wasn't responding to commands his brain was frantically sending. Footsteps, running. James's face appeared above him, mouth moving urgently. But Robert couldn't hear him. The world had gone completely, utterly silent. He blinked, confused. James was clearly shouting something, but it was like watching television with the volume turned all the way down. No sound. Nothing. Just eerie, absolute quiet. His own breathing made no noise. His hand, when he finally managed to move it, brushed against the dirt soundlessly. The panic hit then, crashing over him in waves. Robert tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but he couldn't even hear his own voice. His lips moved, words formed, but they disappeared into the void. Everything after that came in fractured images. The ambulance. He knew it was an ambulance only by seeing it. The paramedics with their urgent expressions and silent mouths. The hospital room where doctors in white coats examined him with instruments he couldn't hear clicking or beeping. And through it all, Madison, his wife, beautiful, perfect Madison with her salon blonde hair and her designer clothes, and her face twisted in what looked like anguish. She held his hand in the hospital bed. Her mouth moved in what must have been words of comfort. Tears streamed down her carefully made-up face, leaving tracks of mascara like black rain. Robert watched her cry and felt nothing but a strange detachment, as if he was already separating from this world that had lost all sound. The diagnosis came after 3 days of tests. The neurologist was young, probably fresh out of residency, and his discomfort was obvious, even without hearing his words. He had someone write it out on a whiteboard. Severe bilateral sensorineural hearing loss, traumatic damage to both auditory nerves, likely permanent. Robert stared at those words until they stopped making sense. Permanent. That was the one that kept standing out. Not temporary, not fixable. Permanent. At 38 years old, he would never hear another sound for the rest of his life. The young doctor kept writing, explaining something about cochlear implants, about hearing aids that might provide some benefit, about speech therapy and sign language classes. Robert stopped reading halfway through. Madison squeezed his hand. She'd been squeezing his hand constantly for 3 days, as if she could somehow transfer sound back into him through touch alone. Her eyes were red-rimmed, swollen from crying. He should feel grateful, he thought distantly. She was here. She was staying. She hadn't run from this disaster. But something about her tears felt wrong, too performative, like she was playing a role she'd rehearsed but didn't quite believe. Robert pushed the thought away. He was being paranoid, traumatized. This was his wife. She'd promised forever, and she was here. That's what mattered, wasn't it? The first weeks home were torture. The house that Robert had always loved, the custom-built estate with its soaring ceilings and its walls of windows overlooking the valley, became a prison. Every room echoed with remembered sounds he'd never hear again. The crackling of the fireplace, the soft pad of footsteps on hardwood, the laughter that used to fill these spaces when they entertained. All gone, replaced by suffocating silence. Madison hired help immediately. A team of speech therapists, sign language instructors, occupational therapists. The best that money could buy, which was considerable given Robert's resources. She studied right alongside him, practicing signs for hours each evening, her fingers shaping words with increasing fluency. Within 2 months, she was nearly conversational. Within 4, she was better than some of the interpreters they hired. Everyone marveled at her dedication. What a wife, they said. What devotion. Robert tried to feel grateful. She was working so hard, transforming her entire life to accommodate his disability. But he kept noticing little things. The way her smile never quite reached her eyes when she signed, "I love you." The impatience that flickered across her face when he struggled to understand a complex phrase. The frequency with which she found reasons to leave the house, shopping trips, spa appointments, lunches with friends that stretched into late afternoons. She'd signed the explanations with perfect technique, but her body language told a different story. Or maybe he was just becoming paranoid. Maybe losing his hearing had made him suspicious of everyone and everything. Maybe he was reading darkness into innocent actions because his own world had gone dark. That's what he told himself. That's what he wanted to believe. Then there was Ellen. Ellen Rodriguez had been their housekeeper for 5 years. She came 3 times a week to clean, occasionally cooked when they entertained, and generally kept the household running smoothly. She was in her 40s, had raised 3 kids on her own after her husband died, and had the kind of warm maternal presence that made even the vast, cold spaces of the Mitchell estate feel momentarily like home. When Robert came back from the hospital, Ellen was there on the doorstep. She didn't have flowers or a card or any of the usual trappings that acquaintances bring to tragic situations. She just had tears running down her round face, and her arms opened wide. Robert let her hug him, let her cry into his shoulder while he stood there, numb and silent, unable to hear whatever words she was murmuring. After that, everything changed with Ellen. She couldn't learn sign language, couldn't afford classes, didn't have time between working 2 jobs and taking care of her elderly mother, But she found her own way. When she needed to tell him something, she'd grab a notepad and write in her careful elementary school handwriting. When that took too long, she'd resort to elaborate pantomime, pointing, gesturing, making exaggerated facial expressions until Robert understood. It should have been frustrating. It should have felt patronizing. Instead, it was somehow the most honest communication he'd had with anyone. Because Ellen wasn't performing, wasn't trying to demonstrate how compassionate she was. She was just trying to connect with him, using whatever tools she had available. When she brought him coffee in the morning, she'd place it down and then tap the side of the cup and blow on her fingers, making an exaggerated too hot face. When she finished cleaning a room, she'd find him and give an enthusiastic thumbs up with a proud grin that needed no translation. Once he found her in the kitchen, frustrated to tears because she wanted to ask him something but couldn't figure out how to communicate it. She finally dragged him to the pantry and pointed at various items until he understood she was asking what he wanted for dinner. Robert had written out, "Whatever you think is good." Ellen's face had lit up like he'd given her a gift instead of a simple answer. Madison walked in on that scene, saw Ellen standing close to Robert, saw the notepad they were sharing, saw the smile on the housekeeper's face. Something flickered across Madison's expression, something cold and calculating that was gone so fast, Robert almost thought he'd imagined it. Almost. The months dragged on. Robert tried to rebuild his life around the silence. He couldn't go back to the office. Not yet. Too many meetings, too many conference calls, too much rapid-fire negotiation that depended on hearing subtle tones and reading between the lines. His business partner, David Chen, kept things running. They'd been friends since college, built the company together from nothing. David came by the house regularly, always patient, always willing to text or write everything out. Never made Robert feel like a burden. He was a good friend, the best, or so Robert believed. The isolation was crushing. Friends stopped calling, or stopped texting more accurately. At first there were plenty of concerned messages, offers to visit, expressions of support. But Robert was terrible at responding. The effort of typing out replies exhausted him. The pity in everyone's virtual voices made him want to throw his phone through a window. So he stopped responding, and gradually, they stopped reaching out. People have their own lives, their own problems. You can only maintain compassion for someone else's tragedy for so long before it becomes background noise in your own busy existence. Robert understood. He didn't blame them, but it hurt anyway. Madison was still there, of course, still playing the devoted wife, still studying sign language with impressive dedication, still making sure he had everything he needed. But she was different, distant, like she was physically present but emotionally somewhere else entirely. Her phone was constantly in her hand now, constantly lighting up with messages that she'd angle away from his view. When he'd enter a room, she'd quickly close whatever she was looking at and smile at him. That practiced, empty smile. He tried to tell himself he was imagining things, but deep down, in places he didn't want to examine, Robert knew. Something was wrong. Something had changed, and he was trapped in silence, unable to hear the truth that everyone else seemed to know. The accident had taken his hearing. But somehow, in the cruelest possible irony, it had also opened his eyes. He just wasn't ready yet to see what they were showing him. Not yet. But soon, very soon, the truth would become impossible to ignore. And when it did, the silence wouldn't be the worst thing he'd lost. Not even close. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, 18 months after the accident. Robert was sitting in his study, pretending to review financial reports, but actually just staring at numbers that meant nothing anymore. The business ran itself these days. David handled everything. Robert had become a passenger in his own empire. He almost deleted the message. The subject line read, "Breakthrough in auditory nerve regeneration." Just another spam promising miracle cures that didn't exist. But something made him click it open. Dr. Heinrich Steiner, Director of Neurotechnology Research at the Keller Institute in Switzerland. Robert recognized the name vaguely from medical journals he'd read obsessively in those first desperate months after losing his hearing. The email was professionally written, cautious in its claims, but the core message made Robert's heart race. Experimental trials using bioengineered nerve grafts combined with stem cell therapy had successfully restored hearing in 3 patients with traumatic nerve damage similar to his. 3 patients. Out of how many? The email didn't say. Success rate? Unclear. Risks? Probably substantial. Robert read the message 5 times. Then he read the attached research paper, struggling through the dense medical terminology. Then he sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, feeling something he hadn't felt in a year and a half. Hope. Dangerous, terrifying hope. He could hear again. The possibility existed. It wasn't guaranteed, wasn't even likely, but it was possible. His finger hovered over the reply button. Then he thought about Madison, about telling her, about watching her face light up with that performative excitement, watching her immediately start planning, start taking control, start making it about her dedication and sacrifice, about David finding out, insisting on coming along, being supportive in that careful way that lately felt less like friendship and more like obligation, about everyone knowing, everyone watching, everyone waiting to see if the miracle happened, or if he failed again. Robert closed his laptop. If he did this, he'd do it alone. 3 weeks later, Robert boarded a flight to Zurich. He told Madison he was going to a medical conference in Boston, showing her the fake itinerary he'd created. She'd signed her enthusiastic support, kissed him goodbye with those empty lips, and immediately returned to her phone. Ellen had driven him to the airport. She'd written on her notepad, "You look nervous. Everything okay?" Robert had smiled and written back, "Just anxious about the conference." "First big trip alone." Ellen had squeezed his hand. "You're stronger than you know," she'd written, then added a little heart. Such a simple gesture. But it meant more than all of Madison's elaborate sign language declarations combined. The flight was long. Robert spent it reading and rereading Dr. Steiner's research, trying to manage his expectations, trying not to let hope balloon into certainty. The procedure had a 38% success rate, meaning 62% of patients experienced no improvement. Some actually got worse, increased tinnitus, vertigo, neurological complications. But 38% hurt again. Those odds would be terrible for a business investment. For getting his life back, Robert would take them. The Keller Institute was housed in a modern glass building overlooking Lake Zurich. Dr. Steiner met him in a consultation room with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that probably cost more than most people's cars. The doctor was older than Robert expected, mid-60s, with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen both miracles and failures. He spoke slowly, clearly, allowing Robert to read his lips. "Mr. Mitchell, I appreciate you traveling so far." He slid a tablet across the desk. "I've prepared everything in writing for you. The assessment took 3 days. Brain scans, auditory tests, nerve response measurements, psychological evaluations. They mapped every millimeter of damage, calculated probabilities, ran simulations. Dr. Steiner was cautiously optimistic. The nerve damage was severe but localized. Robert was young, healthy, his brain neuroplastic enough to potentially relearn auditory processing. "I won't lie to you," the doctor said during their final consultation, his expression grave. "This is experimental. We've had successes, yes, but we've also had failures. You could wake up exactly as you are now. You could wake up worse. Or," he paused, met Robert's eyes directly, "you could wake up hearing again." "What are my real chances?" Robert wrote on the tablet between them. Dr. Steiner considered. "Given your specific case, I'd say 40%, maybe 45, less than half." A coin toss weighted toward failure. Robert wrote, "When can we schedule it?" The surgery was set for the following Monday. Robert spent the weekend in a hotel near the lake, walking through unfamiliar streets, watching people talk and laugh and live their lives full of sound he couldn't access. He thought about Madison, about whether she actually loved him or just loved what he provided, about whether he even wanted to know the answer. He thought about Ellen, scribbling earnest notes, making silly faces to communicate, treating him like a person instead of a tragedy. He thought about David, his best friend, who'd been so supportive, so present, so careful. When had David started being careful around him? Most of all, Robert thought about truth, about how silence had taught him to observe instead of just listen. How he'd started noticing things he'd missed before, body language, micro-expressions, the things people revealed when they thought you couldn't hear their words. What would he discover if he could hear again? What secrets had been spoken in his presence? Assumed safe because he was deaf. Part of him wanted to know. Part of him was terrified. Monday morning arrived cold and clear. Robert, dressed in the hospital gown, lay on the gurney, watched the anesthesiologist's mouth form words he couldn't hear. Dr. Steiner appeared, scrubbed and gowned. He squeezed Robert's shoulder, a gesture that needed no translation. This might work, or it might not. But we're going to try. Robert closed his eyes as the anesthesia took hold, and hoped. He woke in increments, consciousness returning in foggy waves. Pain came first, a deep, throbbing ache that seemed to pulse from inside his skull. Then awareness of his body, of the hospital bed, of bandages wrapped around his head like a turban. Then sound. At first Robert thought he was imagining it. A low hum, barely perceptible, like the ghost of a memory rather than actual audio. But it grew, slowly, gradually, becoming more distinct. The beeping of a monitor, the whisper of air through a ventilation system, the soft rustle of fabric. Robert's eyes flew open. A nurse was adjusting his IV, her back to him. She was humming, actually humming, a melody he didn't recognize but could hear. He could hear. The sound was muffled, underwater, like listening through thick cotton. But it was there, real, actual sound entering his ears and registering in his brain. Tears streamed down Robert's face, hot and unexpected. Dr. Steiner appeared, his face breaking into a cautious smile. "Can you hear me?" The words were muddy, distorted but comprehensible. Robert nodded, not trusting his voice, not sure he even remembered how to use it properly. "Don't get too excited yet," Dr. Steiner warned. "This is very preliminary. The nerves are regenerating, but they're fragile. Any significant stress or trauma in the next few weeks could reverse the process entirely." Robert barely heard the warning. He was too busy listening to everything. The doctor's breathing, the click of a pen, the distant sound of footsteps in the hallway. The world had sound again. He'd been given a miracle. The recovery took 6 days. Each day, sounds became clearer, sharper, more detailed. Dr. Steiner ran constant tests, monitoring the nerve regeneration, adjusting medications, warning repeatedly about the fragility of the process. "No stress," he emphasized. "I can't stress this enough. Your emotional state directly impacts neurological healing. If you experience severe shock, intense anger, profound trauma, anything that spikes your blood pressure and stress hormones significantly, you could lose everything we've gained." Robert nodded, signed the discharge papers, promised to be careful. But even as he made those promises, he was planning to go home, planning to listen, planning to finally hear the truth he'd been sensing for 18 months. The flight back to Virginia was surreal. Every sound felt amplified, significant. The engine roar, passengers talking, the flight attendant's announcements. 2 years of silence made even mundane noise feel profound. Robert kept his sunglasses on, his expression neutral. No one could know yet. Not until he understood what had happened in his absence. Not until he heard what people said when they thought he couldn't hear. He landed late evening, took a cab home instead of calling anyone to pick him up. The house was dark except for lights in the living room. Robert paid the driver, stood on his own driveway, listening. He could hear crickets, wind in the trees, the distant bark of a dog. It was almost too much, too beautiful, too overwhelming. He opened the front door quietly and heard voices. Madison's laugh, high, musical, genuine in a way it never was with him. "Oh my God, stop! You're terrible!" A male voice responding, warm and familiar. "I'm serious. You should have seen his face when—" Robert froze. That was David's voice. David was here, at his house, late at night, making Madison laugh. He moved toward the living room silently, his heart hammering. "I just feel so trapped sometimes," Madison was saying, her voice taking on that plaintive tone she used when she wanted sympathy. "It's been almost 2 years. 2 years of signing, of careful communication, of pretending everything is fine." "You've been amazing," David said softly. "Really, I don't know how you do it." "Because of you." Madison's voice dropped lower, intimate. "You make it bearable." Robert reached the doorway, looked in. Madison was sitting on the couch, their couch, the one he'd picked out. David was beside her. Close. Too close. His arm stretched along the back of the couch, not quite touching her, but nearly. Madison's hand rested on David's knee. They weren't kissing, weren't embracing, but the body language was clear, unmistakable. This wasn't a friend visiting. This was something else. Robert stepped back before they saw him. His mind was racing, fragmented, trying to process what his newly restored ears were telling him. Madison and David, his wife and his best friend. How long had this been happening? He moved to the stairs, climbed them slowly, each step deliberate. Found the guest bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed in darkness. Below he could hear them talking still. Couldn't make out words anymore, just the tone. Comfortable, familiar, intimate. Robert sat there for hours, listening to the sounds of betrayal, and understood finally what Dr. Steiner had meant about stress, because his heart was racing, his blood pressure spiking, his entire nervous system screaming, and the sounds were starting to fade. No. Robert forced himself to breathe. Slow, deep, calm. He couldn't lose this, not now. Not when he'd just discovered how much he needed to hear. The sounds stabilized. Still there, still clear. But Robert had learned his lesson. He couldn't confront them. Not yet. Not until he was stronger. Until the nerve regeneration was stable. Until he could handle the emotional tsunami without losing his hearing again. He'd have to pretend. Have to act like he was still deaf. Have to live in his own home as a spy, listening to his life fall apart in real time. It was going to destroy him. But he had no choice. Robert lay back on the guest bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to his wife laugh at another man's jokes, and began to plan. Robert came downstairs the next morning, wearing his deafness like armor. Madison was in the kitchen, already dressed in yoga clothes that probably cost more than Ellen made in a month. She looked up when he entered, and her face transformed instantly, that practiced expression of wifely concern sliding into place like a mask. She signed, "Good morning. How was Boston?" Robert forced a smile, signed back, "Fine. Tiring. Poor baby." Her hands moved with technical perfection. "I missed you." The words were flawless, but her voice, God, he could hear her voice now, carried no warmth whatsoever. It was the tone someone uses when reading a grocery list. "I'll make you breakfast," she signed, then turned away. The moment her back was to him, her expression changed completely. The concern vanished, replaced by something flat and bored. She picked up her phone, started typing rapidly, a small smile playing at her lips. Robert watched, his hands gripping the counter edge. This was his life now, watching his wife pretend, hearing the truth beneath the performance. Madison's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and her whole face lit up, genuinely lit up, in a way it never did for him anymore. She typed back quickly, then caught herself, glanced over her shoulder to where Robert stood. He quickly looked away, pretending he'd been staring at nothing. She relaxed, returned to her phone. Robert heard her sigh, soft, almost wistful, the sigh of a woman thinking about someone who wasn't her husband. The coffee maker beeped. Madison poured 2 cups, brought one to Robert. Signed, "Here you go, just how you like it." He accepted it, nodded his thanks. The coffee was terrible, too weak, wrong temperature. Madison had never bothered learning how he actually liked his coffee. She'd been making it wrong for 2 years, and he'd never corrected her because what was the point? He drank it anyway, the bitter liquid matching his mood. Ellen arrived at 9, like she did every Tuesday and Thursday. Robert heard her car in the driveway, a sound he'd missed. An old sedan that rattled and knocked but got her where she needed to go. The front door opened. "Hello? Mrs. Mitchell?" Madison's expression soured, just for a second, but Robert caught it. Then the mask was back. Ellen came into the kitchen, saw Robert, and her entire face transformed with genuine joy. She rushed over, grabbed his hands, squeezed them tight. Then she pulled out her ever-present notepad, wrote in her careful handwriting, "So glad you're back. How was your trip?" Robert wrote, "Good, long, happy to be home." Ellen beamed. Then she drew a little house with a heart over it and showed it to him. Madison rolled her eyes, a gesture she'd never made when Robert could see her. Now, thinking he was looking at Ellen's notepad, She let her real feelings show. "Ellen," Madison said, her voice sharp. "The upstairs bathrooms need cleaning. And the guest room. Someone left it a mess." That was Robert. He'd slept there last night, unable to face the bed he shared with his lying wife. Ellen nodded quickly, gathered her cleaning supplies, headed upstairs. The moment she was gone, Madison muttered under her breath, "I swear she's getting too comfortable here." Robert kept his expression neutral, but his heart was pounding. Madison had never spoken that way about Ellen before. Or had she? Had she been saying things like this all along, when she thought he couldn't hear? Madison's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and something shifted in her expression. "I need to take this," she announced unnecessarily to Robert, then walked out onto the patio. Robert moved closer to the window. He could hear her through the glass, though she'd positioned herself far enough away that she clearly thought she was safe. "Hey." Her voice was completely different now. Soft. Intimate. "No, he just got back this morning. Yeah, he's fine. Same as always." Pause. I know. It's just a little longer. We talked about this." Another pause. Longer this time. "David, don't." But there was no conviction in it. "What if someone hears?" David. She was talking to David. Robert's hands clenched into fists. "Of course I do," Madison continued, her voice dropping even lower. "You know I do. This is just, it's complicated. No, he doesn't suspect anything. How could he?" The words landed like physical blows. "I'll see you Thursday. The usual place." She laughed at something David said. "Stop it! You're terrible!" The same laugh she'd used last night. The genuine one. The one she never used with Robert anymore. She ended the call, stood there for a moment staring at her phone with a dopey smile. Then she seemed to remember herself, straightened up, and walked back inside. Her face was blank again when she came through the door. She signed to Robert. "Just my sister. She wanted to check on us." The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that Robert realized this wasn't new. She'd been doing this for months, maybe longer. How many lies had she told him, safe in the knowledge he couldn't hear her actual conversations? Madison grabbed her purse. "I'm going to the gym, then lunch with Claire. I'll be back around 4. She kissed his cheek, a quick peck, obligatory as a business handshake. Then she was gone, and Robert was alone with his thoughts. And with Ellen, who came back downstairs carrying dirty linens, humming quietly to herself. She stopped when she saw him still standing in the kitchen, set down the laundry basket, pulled out her notepad. "You okay?" she wrote. "You look sad." Robert stared at those simple words. "You look sad." Not, "You look tired," or, "You seem stressed." Sad. She saw it. Saw him. He wrote back, "Just adjusting. Being home." Ellen studied his face for a long moment, then wrote, "I don't believe you, but that's okay. You don't have to tell me." She drew a small smiley face, then added, "But I'm here if you need anything, even if it's just company." Robert felt something crack in his chest. This woman, this housekeeper who could barely communicate with him, saw more, cared more, understood more than his wife of 7 years. He wrote, "Thank you, Ellen. That means a lot." She smiled, squeezed his arm gently, then went back to her work. Robert stood in his empty kitchen, listening to the sounds of normalcy. Ellen's footsteps above, water running, the gentle sounds of someone caring for his home. And he realized something that made him feel simultaneously grateful and desperately sad. Ellen was the only genuine thing left in his life. The days that followed were torture. Robert maintained his charade, pretending deafness while his ears collected secrets like poison. He learned Madison's schedule not from what she signed, but from what she said on the phone when she thought privacy was guaranteed. Thursday lunch wasn't with Claire. It was at the Riverside Inn, where David apparently had a room they used regularly. Her spa appointments were real, but they were followed by coffee meetings with David at a cafe 20 miles away, far enough that they thought they'd never be spotted by anyone who knew them. The girls' weekends she'd started taking? David went on business trips those same weekends. Same cities. Robert listened to it all. Phone conversations, video calls she took in her car, the texts she read aloud to herself without realizing she was making sound. Each revelation was a fresh cut. Each lie she told to his face in perfect sign language was salt in wounds that wouldn't heal. But the worst part wasn't the affair itself. It was listening to how they talked about him. One afternoon, Robert was in his study when Madison came home early. She thought he was upstairs resting. He heard her on the phone immediately. "I'm telling you, it's exhausting," she said, her voice carrying through the house. "Do you know what it's like living with someone who can't even have a conversation? Real conversation, I mean. Not signing everything like we're playing charades." Robert's hands trembled. "I try to be patient. I really do. But sometimes I just want to scream. I want to talk about my day without having to perform every word with my hands. I want to hear him laugh at something I said, not just see him do that weird smile that doesn't reach his eyes anymore. That's not fair to him, Madison." David's voice came through the speakerphone. At least he had the decency to object. "I know it's not fair," Madison shot back. "None of this is fair. I signed up to marry a successful businessman, not a disabled recluse." Disabled recluse. The words echoed in Robert's head. "He's still Robert," David said quietly. "He's still your husband." "Is he, though?" Madison's voice turned bitter. "Because the Robert I married wouldn't have let an accident define him. He would have fought harder, adapted better. Instead, he's given up. He barely runs the company anymore. He sits in that house all day feeling sorry for himself." Robert closed his eyes, absorbing each word like a boxer taking punches. "Maybe I'm terrible for saying this," Madison continued. "Maybe I'm a horrible person. But I didn't ask for this. I didn't choose this life. Neither did he," David said. "I know," Madison's voice cracked. "I know that. But at least he doesn't have to pretend anymore. At least he can just be. I have to perform 24/7, the devoted wife, the patient caregiver. And I'm tired, David. I'm so tired." Robert heard her crying then. Real crying, not the performative tears she sometimes showed him. And he felt something unexpected, a spark of sympathy. Because she was right about one thing. She was trapped too. Trapped by appearances, by expectations, by her own choices. But then, David spoke again. "You don't have to stay, you know. We could—" "No," Madison cut him off sharply. "We've talked about this. The prenup is ironclad. If I leave, I get almost nothing. We have to wait." "Wait for what?" Silence stretched. Long enough that Robert thought the call had dropped. Then Madison said, so quietly he almost missed it, "For something to change. For him to get worse, maybe. His doctors said the isolation could lead to depression, other health issues. If something happened, if he needed long-term care facility or something, then I could step in, take power of attorney, and we could figure things out from there." Robert felt ice water in his veins. She wasn't just waiting for him to be out of the picture. She was hoping for it. Waiting for him to decline enough that she could shuffle him off somewhere and claim his life. "Jesus, Madison." Even David sounded shocked. "Don't judge me," Madison snapped. "You think this is easy? You think I enjoy any of this? I'm doing what I have to do to survive. By waiting for your husband to deteriorate? By playing the long game." Madison's voice rose. "You want me, right? You said you loved me. Well, this is what it takes. Patience. Strategy. Unless you want to walk away empty-handed, this is how it has to be." Another pause. Then David, sounding defeated. "I just wish there was another way." "There isn't." Madison's voice was steel now. "So either you're in this with me, or you're not. But I'm not throwing away years of investment because you suddenly grew a conscience." "I'm in." David said it quickly. Too quickly. "You know I'm in." "Good." Madison's tone softened. "I love you. You know that, right? This is all for us." "I know. I love you too." They talked a few more minutes, making plans for the next time they'd meet. But Robert had stopped listening. His wife wasn't just having an affair. She was actively hoping he'd decline, deteriorate, disappear into some facility where she could forget about him and live happily ever after with his best friend and his money. The betrayal was complete. Robert sat in his study, hands pressed against his face, and felt something inside him shift. He'd been thinking of himself as a victim. Poor deaf Robert, betrayed by everyone he trusted. But that wasn't who he was. That wasn't who he'd ever been. He was Robert Mitchell. He'd built an empire. He'd negotiated deals that made grown men sweat. He'd survived a catastrophic accident and 18 months of silence. And he'd survived this. Madison wanted to play the long game. Fine, he'd play too. But his game would have different rules. Because now he had something they didn't know about. The truth. and he could hear every word. 3 weeks passed like walking through broken glass. Robert became a ghost in his own home, watching his life from the outside. Each morning he woke up, put on his mask of deafness, and stepped into a marriage that was nothing but elaborate theater. Madison played her part beautifully. The caring wife, the patient companion, the woman who sacrificed so much. Every gesture calculated, every sign language conversation a performance worthy of an award. And Robert played his part too. The grateful husband, the recovering patient, the man who suspected nothing. But at night, alone in the guest room he'd claimed as his recovery space, Robert listened and planned. He'd started documenting everything. Not recordings. Those felt too risky, too likely to be discovered. Instead, he kept detailed notes on his laptop, encrypted and backed up to a secure cloud service Madison didn't know existed. Dates, times, conversations. Every lie she told in sign language, followed by the truth she spoke on the phone. Every meeting with David documented by the timestamps on her messages. Robert's lawyer was going to have a field day with this material. But evidence gathering wasn't enough. Robert needed something more. He needed to understand why Madison had stayed if she was so miserable. Why David had betrayed a 20-year friendship. Why they thought this was acceptable. He needed them to show their true faces, not just to him, but to everyone. The opportunity came on a Friday evening. Madison was getting ready for what she'd signed as dinner with the girls. Robert watched her through the bedroom doorway as she applied makeup with surgical precision, transforming herself into the polished woman who'd turn heads at whatever restaurant she was really going to. She caught his reflection in the mirror, turned, signed, "How do I look?" Beautiful. She looked beautiful. She'd always been beautiful. That was the tragedy of it. Her outsides were perfect. Her insides were rotten. Robert signed back, "Gorgeous." She smiled, came over, kissed his cheek. "I'll be back around 11. Don't wait up." The lie came so easily. Robert had checked her messages that morning while she was in the shower. She'd be at the Riverside Inn with David, room 312. They'd ordered champagne for 9 o'clock. "Have fun," Robert signed. The moment her car left the driveway, Robert moved. He'd been planning this for days, had checked and rechecked every detail. Tonight was the night. He drove to the Riverside Inn, parked in the back lot where his car wouldn't be visible from the main entrance. Walked in like he belonged there, confident and purposeful. The front desk clerk barely glanced at him. Room 312 was on the 3rd floor. Robert took the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs. With each step, he felt the weight of what he was about to do. This would end everything. His marriage, his friendship with David, the comfortable lies everyone had been living. But comfortable lies were still lies. He reached the door, stood there, listening, heard Madison's laugh, that genuine one, the one she saved for David, heard David's voice. "I missed you. 3 days felt like forever. I know. I hate being away from you." Robert's hand closed around the door handle. It was unlocked. They felt so safe, so certain they'd never be caught. He opened the door. The scene was exactly what he'd imagined. Madison and David on the couch, close together, champagne glasses on the table, David's arm around her shoulders, her hand on his chest. They looked up simultaneously, faces frozen in identical expressions of shock. Madison went white, actually white, like all the blood had drained from her face. David stood up so fast he knocked over his champagne. "Robert, Jesus, what are you doing here?" Robert finished. His voice came out steady, calm. "I could ask you the same thing, David, but I think I know the answer." Madison was on her feet now, hands already moving in signs. Automatic, panicked signing that made no sound. "I can hear you," Robert said quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke. Madison's hands froze mid-sign. "What?" "I said I can hear you." Robert stepped fully into the room, closed the door behind him. "I've been able to hear for almost a month now. Had an experimental surgery in Switzerland while you thought I was at that conference in Boston." David's face had gone from shocked to gray. "Robert, listen." "Oh, I've been listening." Robert's voice was still calm, but something dangerous underneath. "I've listened to everything. Every phone call, every lie, every conversation you two had about me when you thought I couldn't hear." Madison found her voice. "You've been spying on us?" The accusation was so absurd that Robert almost laughed. Spying? I was living in my own house. You two were just stupid enough to have private conversations in front of someone you thought was deaf. It's not what you think, Madison started. Don't. Robert cut her off with a gesture. Don't insult me further by pretending this is anything other than what it is. I heard you, Madison. I heard you tell David that you were waiting for me to deteriorate, hoping I'd decline enough that you could put me somewhere and take over my life. Madison's face crumpled, but Robert couldn't tell if those were tears of remorse or just fear of consequences. David stepped forward, hands raised like he was approaching a wild animal. Robert, man, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It just happened. It just happened? Robert's calm facade cracked. 20 years of friendship, and it just happened? You were at my hospital bedside when I woke up deaf. You held my hand through physical therapy. And all that time, you were planning to steal my wife? I wasn't planning anything! David's voice rose. It wasn't like that. We tried to fight it, we really did, but my disability made it too easy, Robert finished. I was right there, deaf and clueless, and you two just couldn't resist? The silence that followed was broken only by Madison's quiet sobbing. Robert looked at her, really looked at her. The woman he'd married 7 years ago. The woman he'd built a life with. The woman who'd become a stranger wearing a familiar face. I loved you, he said quietly. Even after the accident, even through the hardest days, I loved you. I thought you were staying because you loved me too. But you were just waiting for the right moment to cash out. That's not true. Madison's voice was desperate now. I did love you. I do love you. This thing with David, it was a mistake. It was just, please stop. Robert held up a hand. I've heard enough lies. I heard what you really think of me. Disabled recluse. That's what you called me. Like I was some pathetic creature you had to tolerate. Madison flinched like he'd slapped her. Robert turned to David. And you, my best friend, my business partner, the person I trusted most in the world besides her. David's eyes were wet. I never meant to hurt you. But you did anyway. Robert's voice cracked slightly. You knew what I was going through. You saw how hard I was fighting just to survive each day. And you used that. You used my vulnerability to take what you wanted. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like, David? Robert demanded. Explain it to me. Make me understand how two people who claim to care about me could betray me so completely. David opened his mouth, closed it. No explanation came. Because there wasn't one. Not really. Just selfishness and opportunity and the human capacity for rationalization. Robert felt something settle in his chest. A cold, hard certainty. I want you out of the company, he said to David. I'll buy out your shares at fair market value. But I want you gone. Robert, that's generous considering I could probably sue you for 6 violations of our partnership agreement. Robert's voice was steel now. Take the offer or face the alternative. David's shoulders slumped in defeat. Robert turned to Madison. And you? Pack your things. You have until Sunday night to move out. Where am I supposed to go? Madison's voice was small now, frightened. That's not my problem anymore. Robert headed for the door. You'll get nothing beyond what the prenup specifies, which, if you remember, is basically nothing. You gambled on me dying or declining. You lost. Robert, please. Madison grabbed his arm. Don't do this. We can work through this. I'll go to counseling. I'll do whatever you want. Just please. He pulled away from her touch. You should have thought about that before you spent 18 months lying to my face. Before you plotted with my best friend about how to get rid of me. I never wanted to get rid of you. Madison was sobbing openly now. I was just scared. I didn't know how to handle it, and I made mistakes, but I never stopped caring. You're still lying. Robert's voice was tired now. Even now, caught red-handed, you're still performing, still trying to manipulate. And honestly, I'm exhausted by it. He opened the door. Robert, wait, David called. At least let us explain. There's nothing to explain. Robert paused in the doorway, looked back at them one last time. You made your choices. Now live with them. He walked out, leaving behind the sound of Madison's crying and David's attempts to comfort her. The hallway seemed impossibly long. Each step felt heavy, final. Robert made it to his car before the shaking started. He sat in the driver's seat, hands gripping the steering wheel, and felt everything he'd been holding back come rushing up. Rage, grief, betrayal, loss. He'd lost so much. His hearing, his wife, his best friend, his illusions. But he'd gained something too. Truth, clarity, self-respect. He'd stopped playing the victim, stopped accepting the crumbs of affection they'd offered while they plotted behind his back. Robert started the car, drove home through streets that looked different now. Everything looked different. Ellen's car was in the driveway. She'd asked if she could come by in the evening to prepare some meals for the week ahead, and he'd agreed. He walked in to find her in the kitchen, surrounded by containers of food she'd been carefully portioning and labeling. She looked up, saw his face, and immediately put down what she was holding. Then she did something she'd never done before. She spoke directly to him, forgetting for a moment that she thought he was deaf. "Oh, honey, what happened?" Robert stared at her, and then, without thinking about it, responded. Everything fell apart. Ellen's eyes went wide. Her mouth fell open. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then Ellen whispered, "You can hear me?" Robert nodded, suddenly exhausted. "I've been able to hear for almost a month." Ellen processed this, her expression shifting through shock, confusion, and finally understanding. "That's why you looked so sad," she said quietly. "You were hearing things you wished you couldn't." Robert felt his eyes burn. This woman, this kind, simple woman who everyone overlooked, understood immediately what others had missed for months. "Yeah," he managed. "That's exactly it." Ellen moved toward him slowly, giving him space to retreat if he needed it. When he didn't, she wrapped her arms around him. And Robert, who hadn't cried in front of anyone since the accident, broke down completely. He sobbed into her shoulder while she held him, patting his back, making soft, soothing sounds that needed no translation. "It's okay," she murmured. "It's going to be okay. You're going to be okay." Robert wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that somehow, eventually the pieces would come back together. But right now, standing in his kitchen with the only honest person left in his life, he just let himself fall apart. Because sometimes that's what you need, to break completely before you can build yourself back up. And Ellen held him through all of it, steady and present and real. 6 months later, Robert sat on his back porch watching the sun rise over the valley. The ranch was quieter now, smaller. He'd sold the main house, too many ghosts, too many memories of a life built on lies. The cottage on the eastern edge of the property had been renovated into something simple but comfortable. 2 bedrooms, an open kitchen, windows that let in light without feeling like you lived in a museum. It felt like home in a way the mansion never had. Robert sipped his coffee, made exactly right now, the way he'd finally taught himself, after realizing he'd been drinking it wrong for years just to avoid conflict. Strong, dark, with just a touch of cream. The divorce had been swift. Madison had tried to fight it first, hiring an expensive attorney who'd looked at the prenup and the evidence Robert's lawyer presented and advised her to accept the settlement. She'd walked away with a modest sum, enough to start over, not enough to maintain the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to. She'd moved to California. Robert heard she was working for a real estate company, selling the kinds of houses she used to live in. There was a certain poetry to that. David was gone from the business entirely. Robert had restructured the company, brought in new partners, and discovered he actually enjoyed the work again when he wasn't being betrayed by the person sitting across the conference table. The company was thriving. Turned out Robert Mitchell hadn't lost his edge, just his faith in people who didn't deserve it. But the biggest change wasn't the business, or the house, or the divorce. It was him. The sliding door opened behind him. Robert smiled without turning around. He'd know those footsteps anywhere now. "You're up early," Ellen said, bringing her own cup of coffee to sit in the chair beside him. "Couldn't sleep. Too much on my mind." Ellen had moved into the cottage 3 months ago. Not as a housekeeper. Robert had insisted she stop working for him in any professional capacity. She'd resisted at first, uncomfortable with the change, worried about what people would think. "Let them think whatever they want," Robert had told her. "I spent too many years caring about appearances. I'm done with that." So Ellen had moved in as, well, they hadn't exactly defined it. Friend, companion, someone who made the space feel less empty and more like a home. Something was growing between them, slow and careful, like a plant that had been given room to find its own way toward sunlight. They hadn't rushed it, hadn't tried to force something into being before it was ready. Robert was learning patience, learning that healing takes time, learning that sometimes the best things develop quietly, without fanfare or grand gestures. "What are you thinking about?" Ellen asked, following his gaze across the valley. "How different everything sounds now," Robert said. "Not just because I can hear again, but because I'm actually listening." Ellen smiled. She understood. She always understood. "I heard a cardinal this morning," Robert continued. "Took me 20 minutes to figure out what bird makes that sound. Looked it up on my phone like an idiot." He laughed. 2 years of silence, and I forgot what half the birds sound like. "You're relearning the world," Ellen said softly. "That takes time. Time. That word again. Robert had so much of it now. Or rather, he'd stopped wasting it on people and things that didn't matter. His phone buzzed. A message from his sister in Seattle, asking how he was doing. Robert had reconnected with family over the past months, people he'd neglected while building his empire, while maintaining his perfect marriage to his perfect wife. Turned out his sister was funny. His nephew was getting ready for college. His mother, who he'd called dutifully but distantly for years, had stories he'd never heard because he'd never bothered to really listen. He was listening now. "I'm meeting James for lunch today," Robert said. "He wants to talk about expanding the stables." James, the stable manager who'd tried to warn him about midnight that fateful morning. Robert had given him a raise, made him a partner in the ranch operations, and apologized for being too arrogant to listen. James had accepted all three with his usual quiet grace. "That's good," Ellen said. "You've been wanting to do more with the horses." Robert had started riding again a month ago. Tentatively at first, afraid of the memories, afraid of falling. But midnight was gone. Sold to a ranch in Montana where he'd have space to run without carrying the burden of Robert's trauma. The new horses were gentler, and Robert was humbler. "Ellen," Robert said, turning to face her, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you stay?" The question had been building in him for weeks. "When I was deaf, when everyone else was tiptoeing around me or plotting behind my back, you just stayed. Why?" Ellen was quiet for a moment, considering. The morning light caught the silver threads in her dark hair, made her brown eyes warm. "Because you needed someone who saw you," she finally said. "Not deaf Robert or rich Robert or poor Robert who had an accident. Just Robert, the person. But you hardly knew me." "I knew enough," Ellen smiled. "I knew you said thank you to the person who cleaned your house. I knew you asked about my mother when she was sick. I knew you never treated me like I was invisible, even when other people did." She paused, looked down at her coffee. "My husband, before he died, he used to say that you can tell everything about a person by how they treat people who can't do anything for them. You treated me with respect when I was just the housekeeper. That told me who you really were." Robert felt his throat tighten. "I didn't do anything special. That's the point," Ellen said gently. "You didn't have to try to be decent. You just were. That's rare, Robert. Rarer than you think." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the valley wake up. A deer moved through the trees below. Birds called to each other. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Normal sounds. Beautiful sounds. Sounds Robert had lost and found again, and now treasured in a way he never had before. "I used to think I had everything," Robert said quietly. "The business, the money, the beautiful wife, the status. And then I lost my hearing and realized none of it mattered. None of it was real." "Some of it was real," Ellen countered. "Your success was real. You built that. But I built it for the wrong reasons." Robert shook his head. "I wanted to prove something. Wanted to be impressive. Wanted people to look at me and think I had it all figured out. And now? Now I just want to be honest." Robert met her eyes. "I want to live a life where I don't have to perform. Where the people around me actually care about me, not what I can give them. Where if I lose everything tomorrow, the people who matter will still be there." Ellen reached over, took his hand. Her palm was warm, calloused from years of work, real. "You won't lose everything," she said, "because you're building something different now, something that can't be taken away." "What's that?" "Yourself." Ellen squeezed his hand. "The real you, not the version you thought you had to be." Robert looked at their joined hands. 6 months ago, this would have felt wrong. Too soon. A rebound. What would people think? Now he didn't care what people thought. He cared what he felt, and what he felt was peace. "I'm glad you're here," he said simply. "Me too." They stayed like that as the sun climbed higher. Two people who'd found each other in the wreckage of Robert's old life and were slowly building something new. No grand declarations, no dramatic promises, just presence, just honesty, just two people choosing each other, one ordinary morning at a time. Later that afternoon, Robert drove into town for his lunch with James. Past the Riverside Inn where he'd confronted Madison and David 6 months ago. Felt nothing. No anger, no pain, no regret. Just a distant acknowledgement that it had happened, and he'd survived it, and moved on. The restaurant was busy with the lunch crowd. Robert found James at a corner table, already looking at the menu. They shook hands, and Robert was struck by how normal it felt. No awkwardness, no pity, no careful treatment, like he was fragile. Just two men having lunch. They talked about the stables, about James's daughter who was graduating high school, about the weather and the horses and plans for the future. Easy conversation. Real conversation. Halfway through the meal, James paused, set down his fork. "Can I say something?" he asked. "Sure." "You seem happy," James said. "Happier than I've seen you in years, even before the accident." Robert considered that. "I think I am." "Good," James nodded. "You deserve it. You've been through hell." "We all go through our own versions of hell," Robert said. "I just had the advantage of mine being obvious." James smiled at that. "That's a generous way to look at it." "It's true, though." Robert leaned back in his chair. "Most people suffer quietly. Their pain is invisible, so nobody sees it, nobody helps. At least when I was deaf, people knew I was struggling. They could choose to help or not, but they knew. And most chose not to," James observed quietly. "Most did," Robert agreed. "But the ones who chose to help, those are the ones who mattered. And I wouldn't have known who they were if everything hadn't fallen apart." James raised his glass. "To everything falling apart, then." Robert clinked his glass against James's. "To everything falling apart." They finished lunch, made plans for the stable expansion, parted ways with a handshake and genuine smiles. Robert drove home as afternoon light turned the valley golden. Past the old house, now owned by a young family with 3 kids, who'd filled it with the kind of life it had always needed. Pulled into the cottage driveway and saw Ellen in the garden, planting something. She looked up as he got out of the car, waved, smiled, and Robert realized something that made him stop in his tracks. He was happy. Genuinely, deeply, honestly happy. Not because he'd gotten revenge. Not because he'd won. Not because he'd proven anything to anyone. But because he'd stopped pretending. Stopped performing the role of the successful man who had it all together. Stopped valuing things that looked good over things that were good. Stopped mistaking polish for substance, beauty for character, performance for love. The accident had taken his hearing. The betrayal had shattered his illusions. But both had given him something more valuable. The ability to finally hear what actually mattered. Not the words people said, but the truth beneath them. Not the life that looked impressive, but the life that felt authentic. Not the love that was performed, but the love that was lived quietly, in small moments by people who stayed. Robert walked over to Ellen, knelt beside her in the dirt, and picked up a trowel. "What are we planting?" he asked. "Tomatoes," Ellen said. "And maybe some basil. I thought we could make fresh pasta sauce this summer." Sounds perfect. And it was. Not because tomatoes and basil were particularly profound, but because this, right here, right now, planting a garden with someone who cared about him, this was real. This was the sound of truth. And it was the most beautiful thing Robert had ever heard. Life's greatest lesson comes not from what we gain, but from what we lose, and what we discover in the emptiness left behind. Sometimes we spend years perfecting a performance, building a beautiful life that looks perfect to everyone watching. We collect the right accomplishments, the right relationships, the right status symbols, and we call that success. But real success isn't about what impresses others. It's about what sustains us when everything impressive falls away. The people who matter aren't the ones who stay for what you have. They're the ones who stay for who you are, the ones who see you, really see you, when you're stripped of all the things you thought defined you. We often chase love that announces itself, that performs grand gestures, that looks beautiful from the outside. But the deepest love is quieter. It shows up in small moments, in patience when things are hard, in presence when words fail, in choosing to stay, not because it's impressive, but because it's true. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover what actually matters. And sometimes the person who sees your worth is the one you overlooked while chasing something that merely sparkled. True wealth isn't counted in bank accounts or status. It's measured in genuine connections, honest relationships, and the peace that comes from finally living authentically. The sound of truth is softer than performance, but it echoes longer.